Hello everyone, welcome to another Let's Read video with Mr. Lou. This one is going to be focused on Eugene v. Debs, an American paradox, and this source comes to us from the Monthly Labor Review, August 1991. Now this is really important. I'm going to write the word source here. This is really important for us because this document, unlike many of the others, is what is known as a secondary source. A secondary source is a document that is written about someone or about history that draws on an understanding of who that person is or was and what they did. So usually it's written after the fact, we'll call it after the fact, or it's written after the events that it is written, and it usually has an element of analysis in it. Analysis in it. And it's also always good that when you're talking about secondary sources to examine the bias of the secondary source. And bias is another way to look at a point of view, the point of view of the source, right? Because the source is writing about something or about someone. So they're going to have a certain point of view, and we could also be thinking about maybe, it's another word for bias might be slant, or a political viewpoint that is really part of the document. Okay, so this is important for us when we're looking at secondary sources. Now, the opposite of a secondary source is what's called a primary source, and most of the documents that we have for this project, the ones you've been reading, are primary sources. Most of them are speeches. Okay, so this one is a secondary source. So we could have found a speech by Eugene v. Debs where he talked about his ideas. That would be a primary source. Speeches. Another thing we have, like from Martin Luther King, we have a letter. These are primary sources where they're the person's own words. These are primary sources. Mr. Daniels is a newspaper account that's written at the time that the events occur, considered a primary source?
Yes, it is.
Okay. Another kind of primary source would be a contemporary newspaper. What if it's an editorial?
At the time, yes.
Okay. So really about primary and secondary, it really has to do with whether or not it's at the time. So a contemporary source at the time of the event. So at the time, I'll put that there. And a secondary source is often or always looking back on history. Looking back. And this particular document is definitely looking back. So this is an important distinction for you to have. You'll notice that in the National History Day guidelines, it talks about primary and secondary sources. And usually, if you're going to write a good history, you want to use both. So now about Eugene v. Debs. He's a really interesting fellow, and that's why I selected this for a little more in-depth analysis. So I'm going to read what he has written, or what has been written about him, and talk about how you would read this document a little bit. So I'll read some of it out loud, I'll highlight some things, and we'll just go through him. All right. First, the source. Really important. This is the Monthly Labor Review. So I would be thinking, as I'm looking at this source, here's some questions. Is there a political slant to this? Might there be? And probably there is. But the monthly labor review is also what we call, and you can tell just by the way the document is set up, that this is from what is really going to probably be a peer-reviewed source written by academics. So there might be some political slant, but there's not. But it is going to be a credible source, because in the hierarchy of sources, something like the monthly labor review is a pretty quality source. You can see here's a little information on the author. All right, this is the kind of thing that you would put in your paper to prove that this source is credible. So this author, Robert Constantine, is Professor Emeritus of History at Indiana State University. So is he someone who knows what he's talking about? Absolutely. Might he have a particular political viewpoint that this article is written from? Probably. Are there going to be things in this article that are not facts? Probably not. But he might look at those facts, this particular author, Constantine, might look at those facts and draw some conclusions that have a little bit of a political slant. That's the difference. So we can say credible, yeah, because there's going to be solid facts in here, because a history professor is not going to be making stuff up, okay? So credible, yeah, it's going to have solid facts. But the conclusions drawn from those facts could have a little bit of a political slant, because we don't know about Robert Constantine's politics, but something like the monthly labor review, there's a good chance that it has a particular understanding of U.S. history and the place of labor in that history that might be different. And I would say that there's a pretty good chance that it could have what we would say would be a liberal political slant. Now, I don't know that for sure, but I'm just going to speculate that is possible. All right, Eugene Victor Debs played an important role in popularizing ideas and ideals which were denounced as radical, even un-American, in the early part of the 20th century. All right, so this is definitely, the author is letting us know in that first sentence why we would be interested in reading about Eugene V. Debs. Okay, so he was a popularizer, popularizing, making them popular. So they were denounced as radicals. So we talk about the United States as an evolution of ideas. A lot of time ideas come along and they are first seen as radical, outside the mainstream, extreme. They're not going to fit. They're un-American. And then later, some of those ideas are adopted and they become what's part of the mainstream. All right, and I think that's what this article is saying about Eugene V. Debs. These ideas were later considered orthodox. Orthodox is another word for mainstream, and are now viewed as traditional. His career marked an honorable chapter in the history, and this is one of the reasons I like him. Makes it a little bigger. An honorable chapter in the history of American dissent. Okay, now so here's where we have the author injecting maybe some of his bias. We could read that as an honorable chapter. He's really kind of making a statement that about what this idea of American dissent is, and that is an awesome word if you don't know it. Dissent is a word that basically means disagreement and protest. Disagree, protest. It's a powerful descriptive word, and there is a proud history of dissent. So I guess I agree with Robert Constantine when he talks about dissent as being a good thing, because we can, in this country, one thing we know how to do, and it's been throughout our history, is we know how to disagree. History significantly enhanced by Debs' willingness to pay a heavy price. Okay, so now he's got my interest. A heavy price for holding unpopular views. All right, I bet we'll find out more about that heavy price as we continue reading. Debs was born in Terre Haute, Indiana on November 5th, 1855. All right, so now I'm going to be thinking about our timeline of American history, right? All right, 1855, what was going on in 1855? That was before the Civil War. That's when he was born. So he was born right before the Civil War. All right. This is how you want to read these documents, right? You're adding to your understanding right before Civil War, okay? In Indiana, which was a free state, okay? So he's from the North. Debs left school when he was 14 years old and took a job in the Terre Haute Railroad shop, which paid him 50 cents a day for scraping grease and paint off of locomotives. That is a really great little detail when you're writing about someone. To add a little detail like that gives you an idea what that person's character might be like. So I would really applaud John Constantine for adding this kind of detail. I would say that is an awesome detail. And we'll have to see how that plays in with his later description of who this fellow is. So he joined the Brotherhood of Locomotive Firemen in 1875, which is an organization of laborers, and soon began serving as an organizer and recording secretary for the union. Okay, so it was more than just an organization, it was an official union. And that is what are unions and what do they do and what part did they play in history, in U.S. history? That's a huge question. And if you don't know, that would be a great place to start learning. What are unions? Because they have been a very powerful force. What are unions? I don't know. That's probably not how you spell union. I'm not real sure about that. Maybe I'll just look over here. U-N-I. Oh, looks all right. What are unions and how have they shaped U.S. history? That is a huge question. And it would be a pretty fun question to answer. He was elected as the National Secretary Treasurer for the Union. Okay, he's a union official. So here he is, a young man. He was elected in the legislature. All right, his public service appeared. So this is a lot of biographical information. He gained recognition as an effective union organizer and labor journalist. All right, so what would a labor journalist entail? In addition to organizing numerous firemen's locals, Deb also organized locals for the Brotherhood of Railroad Brakemen. Okay, and why? Why would they need all these different organizations? What were they there for? He also assisted in the organization of carpenters and painters locals in Terre Haute and in other Indiana cities and responded to calls for help in organizing miners locals. All right? So all of this stuff about unions, if you don't know what a union is or what unions do or have done, you're going to be pretty lost when you read this stuff. So I would definitely recommend looking up what unions are if you don't know. Frustrated by the failure of the railroad brotherhoods to maintain solidarity, this is another great word if you don't know it. Solidarity is another word for unity. Unity. In their dealings with management, especially during strikes, Deb resigned as Secretary-Treasurer in 1892. So now we're thinking about him if he was born in, 1855, and now it's 1892, 55, 65, 75, 85, 92. Here we are. He's already 40 years old. Okay? And while he's doing this type of stuff, if I did my math correctly, he founded and became president of the American Railway Union. Throughout its brief dramatic career, the Railroad Union attracted thousands of members. 18-day strike against James J. Hill's Great Northern Railroad, 1894. A few months later, the new union, but in sympathy with the striking Pullman Palace car workers. And this is a very famous piece of U.S. history that if you don't know about it, you want to add this to your background knowledge that you can draw from. It's called the Pullman Strike. If you just do a little search for that, you'll find tons of information on the Pullman Strike. The resulting Pullman Strike of 1894, possibly the most famous strike in American labor history. Okay, so now they're going to help us. Let us know that that is really important. Possibly the most famous strike in American labor history. Paralyzed much of the commerce in the western half. Do you know, by the way, that there are workers right now threatening to strike in 2014? Let me just put that right here. 2014, I believe it's the longshoremen at the port of Los Angeles are thinking about doing a strike, and people are concerned that it will affect Christmas shopping this year. So this idea of a labor union organizing a strike is something that is still with us. It just happens that the 1894 Pullman Strike is the most famous one. Paralyzed much of the commerce in the western half of the nation before being broken by an alliance of railroad management and the full legal and military power of the federal government. Wow, that sounds interesting. So we are talking about, the full, so it was broken. What does it mean to break a railroad strike? And what does it mean that the railroad management had the full legal, and military power of the federal government? Are we talking about factions here? Are we talking about the labor, the management of the railroad, the people who own the railroad and the federal government forming a faction together to break or destroy or end the labor strike? And what does that mean? In the aftermath of the Pullman Strike, Debs was imprisoned for 6 months at the Woodstock, Illinois jail for violating the blanket injunction handed down by the federal court in Chicago against the American Railway Union leadership. While in prison, Debs became convinced that no union could protect the interests of workers and the prevailing economic and political system, and in January 1897, he announced his conversion to socialism. All right, so here is a word that is really thrown all over the place in 2014, usually as like a epithet. All right, and if you don't know that word, it's spelled, I think, like this. An epithet is basically a name that you call someone, So you are a socialist. But what does this actually mean, this word socialism? It's been a part of American history since 1897, and you can see it was a contentious issue back then, and it still is. So epithet would be like, you are a socialist. But what does that term really mean? I think a lot of people aren't really sure what that means, but it's just kind of tossed around. So we're going to find out about Debs, who was he was an unabashedly socialist leader. He said, "Yes, I am a socialist, because there is no way that we can protect the rights of these workers in the system that we have. And so, yes, I am a socialist." And if you want to learn more about him, keep on reading.